All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning for the PARCC and DC Science Technology Coordinator Training. My name is Stephanie Snyder. I'm the Interim Director of Assessments here at ASSE, and I want to thank you for joining us today. I am joined by a number of colleagues from ASSE and from Pearson who will be leading us through the presentation this morning. In the chat box, Chelsea Charland has dropped a link to a sign-in form for this morning's training. Please, when you have a minute, sign in using that form. If you're not able to access the form, please send us an email at asse.assessment@dc.gov to let us know that you're here this morning. At this time, I would like to turn it over to Kaylee Brown and Jeff Heathman at Pearson, who will be guiding us through this morning's training. As you're coming in, please put yourself on mute. If you do have questions, we will pause throughout to answer those questions. You can also feel free to drop them in the chat. But for now, I'll turn it over to Jeff and Kaylee.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephanie. Welcome, everybody. As Stephanie said, my name is Kaylee Brown. I'm at Pearson, and I've got with me Jeff Heathman. He'll be helping answer questions and kind of monitoring the chat for me, so I appreciate his help. All right, and welcome, everybody, to the PARCC and DC Science Technology Training. We're glad you're here. So just to go over some of our objectives for today. We want to provide you some information about Pearson's technology platforms for spring 2022 testing, and then also give you some resources where you can go if anything is going wrong during testing, heaven forbid, and provide you some ways to troubleshoot and fix those issues, as well as just some general overview of how to do things in some of Pearson's technology platforms, such as TestNav 8 and Pearson Access next. So our agenda for today, we're going to start out going over some resources that are available to you, and then we'll go over TestNav 8, which is Pearson's testing platform for students. And then we will go into the Pearson Access Next section, which is what you'll use to register your students and set up testing and start the sessions, resume students, all of that stuff will be in Pearson Access Next. We'll go over some just basic technology setup, how to download TestNav, how to get into Pearson Access Next, all that stuff. And then we will talk a little bit about the infrastructure trial, which is just basically a test run of testing before you get into the testing season to make sure that everything's working correctly, make sure everybody kind of knows what their roles are, what they're doing. And then we'll walk through testing, before testing, during testing, after testing, some of the tasks that you'll need to do during testing, throughout testing. And then we'll finish off with just some additional information and again, some resources that can help you as you go through this testing cycle. All right, so starting out, we just wanted to point you to the DC resource site. This site is live and we've updated all the support documents, the forms, and the manuals for 2022 testing. The site contains test administrator and test coordinator manuals, the accessibility features and accommodations manual, user guides for TestNav and Pearson Access Next, and more. So this is kind of going to be your go-to place for any resources that we either talk about here or that you need before, during, and after testing. In addition to some of the locations that we've added on this slide on the DC support site, we have some additional resources posted in the documentation section in Pearson Access Next. You can access this documentation by clicking the support icon on Pearson Access Next homepage and going to the documentation section, and I'll show you what that looks like a little bit later on. This area of PAN contains things like the Srpmp field definitions guide, user file field definitions guides, and then various layouts available to be downloaded and used as upload files for Pearson Access Next. So that's all contained in the PAN site. Also posted on the DC resources site, we have several training modules available if you wanted some additional training on PAN or TestNav. Those are in the manuals and modules section of the DC training site. You can get kind of a general PAN overview, some of the things I'm going to talk about here in this training, and then also something similar for TestNav, all in these training modules. So that will finish off the resources section. Is there any questions? I'll pause for a minute and see if anybody has questions on the resource site or anything I just went over. Okay. Great. So we are going to go in and talk a little bit about TestNav, which again is Pearson's testing platform for students. So some of the TestNav system requirements, we have them linked here as well, and they're also linked on the TestNav app itself. Just as a reminder, browser-based testing is only available in non-secure tests, and that's things like practice tests for students or things like that. For the 2022 PARCC and DC Science tests, only secure testing is allowed, so you can only test via the TestNav app. We're not doing browser testing for this year. In order to successfully run the TestNav app, the operating systems on the screen right now are the only ones that are supported. Note that secure testing is not yet supported on Android devices. There's a security concern with Google that's yet to be addressed for us to properly support secure testing via Android. But iOS, Chrome, Mac, Safari, all of those are supported operating systems to have testing in. As linked here on this slide are some additional resources for TestNav and the system requirements. We also wanted to note that since our last testing year, these are the new operating systems that are now supported by TestNav. So iOS 13, 14X, Chrome OS, Mac, Safari 14, all those are now officially supported through TestNav. If students are taking or are testing via an iPad, there are a couple of additional steps that may be required when setting up TestNav on that device, including allowing a microphone and allowing the app lock feature, which means that the student will not be able to access any other applications, including the internet, until submitting or logging out of their test. Because we're using secure testing, the student must accept the app self-lock message in order to test. If they don't accept it, they'll be exited and they'll need to go back and sign in again. If TestNav is not currently downloaded on your testing devices, you can access and download the app from the web address here on this slide. Note that Java and any specific pop-up blocker settings are not required to run TestNav itself. The TestNav experience is going to be the same for students across devices and is accessible with touchscreen devices. So we just talked about iPad, for instance. Note that you should always test your devices for assistive technology features and compatibility by completing an infrastructure trial, which we're again going to be going on later on in this presentation. So this is what the download page looks like for TestNav. If you require a download for a different operating system and you don't see it immediately on the screen, you can see a link here that says download TestNav for another platform. You can just click on that and there will be a list of the platforms and a download button for each one. When you first download TestNav, you may need to select the DC customer from a list that will pop up. Once you do so, you'll be taken to this sign-on screen, shown on screen right here. From here, you can also access practice tests via the link at the bottom here. And then this other screenshot just shows what that practice test page looks like and what practice tests are available for you to kind of play around in. So as we're coming to the end of the TestNav section, I just wanted to point out some of the error messages that you may see that are new for this year. These are listed along with instructions on resolving the error in the TestNav user guide, which is kind of linked throughout this presentation, but it's on the support assessment site at Pearson. It'll list the error code, what it means, and then how to resolve that error. All right, so that's it for the TestNav section. I'll pause to see if there are any questions, if anybody has any questions about downloading TestNav, getting it set up.
Kaylee, I do have a question in the chat I'd like to give voice to. It says, for the real test, is there any problems with TestNav for DC versus Maryland students running it from Chromebooks?
So yeah, I'm not sure exactly if there's been issues in the past that you've experienced, but there shouldn't be any problems. TestNav, like I said, is supported on Chromebooks as well as OS and iOS devices. You can switch customers, and maybe that's what you're asking about, is switching from DC to the Maryland site, and you can do so easily. And there's actually instructions a bit later on in this PowerPoint if you need to do that. So yeah, it's the same TestNav app for all of our customers, all of our tests. It's all run through TestNav.
I do have another question is if we have the TestNav app from previous years, do we need a new app installed?
So best practice is to install the new version of the app, just because there have been some updates for this year. And if the TestNav app version has been added long enough ago, you may experience some errors while trying to get students into testing. So we always suggest you delete and re-download the app. That's a great question. I'm glad you asked that. All right. Thank you for those questions. Appreciate it. So moving on to the Pearson Access next slides. So when you first go to the PAN page, this is going to be the main operational Pearson Access Next homepage. There's also a training site, which I'll show you later on. But this is what both of those sites kind of look like. When you first go to them, you'll see the sign-in icons on the right-hand side of the page. Once you log in, you'll be taken to this screen. Notice that this year there's been a user interface change to PAN, wherein the menu that used to be across the top of the page is now on the left side of the page. This is only true for the home page. The rest of the site is going to be the same as it was in previous years, but this just kind of helps you see, at a glance, what options you have, what pages are available in PAN for you to go to. And then once you get into those pages, that menu bar will be across the top, and you'll see that in screenshots a bit later on in this presentation. So as you all probably know, our admin window for PARCC and DC Science for this year is April 4th through May 27th. Paper testing ends on May 20th. Note that the deadline for initial registration, it was February 16th, so earlier this week for LEAs, and it's next Tuesday, February 22nd for non-public schools to complete their P&P loads into PAN for the initial registration. One other thing that we wanted to point out that's been added to PAN for this year is dashboards. The dashboards are available at a coordinator level, both test coordinator and technology coordinators. Since there was no real applicable use for these specific dashboards at the test administrator level, they're not available for test administrators. But the dashboards are meant to show a quick overall view of testing progress, and we've got some examples on the next couple of slides we wanted to show. So this is what the default dashboard view will be. You can see different information in each graph, such as which students are in progress and completed versus students tests within subjects, and more. These graphs are interactive, so you can click into each of them, remove ELA from this graph, for instance, or remove math and just see what science tests you have. And then if you wanted to change this bar graph to a speedometer, for instance, you can change it by selecting the dashboard user settings icon in PAN. So this is the view of the dashboard user settings. You can move the graphs around by clicking and dragging this little cross in the corner. You can change the graph types by using the drop-down menu. So you see here we've got bar graph, stacked bar graph with filters, and then a speedometer. And then you can also change the overall view of the page by changing the number of columns drop-down menus. So here we have it set to 2, so you can see that you'll have 2 columns of the 4 graphs. And then you can also remove graphs that you find you're not using. This is a really great feature that's added for this year that we're excited about. All right, and that's all that we have for sort of the general overview of PAN. Are there any questions? I'll pause here. All right, great. So we're going to go now into more detailed technology setup for spring 2022 testing. The first thing we'll talk about is Proctor Caching. Because of some advances in broadband connectivities at schools and some recent initiatives sort of worldwide, Proctor Caching has kind of become a thing of the past. However, any schools that have a bandwidth of below 100 kilobytes per second should consider the use of Proctor Caching. If your speed is between 100 and 200, you should construct an infrastructure trial without Proctor Caching to see what the student experience is going to be like if there are any delays. And then schools with speeds above 200 don't need to Proctor cache at all because the internet speed is going to be quick enough to automatically send those responses to Pearson. Note that if it's indicated that you should construct an infrastructure trial, the trials should be conducted at the largest scale possible to simulate real testing loads in the school districts to properly evaluate online testing performance. If you have Proctor cached in the past and no longer wish or need to Proctor cache, then you can easily remove Proctor caching from TestNav. There's a couple of methods to do so. The first screenshot shows how to remove a single Proctor caching machine, and that's just by deleting the IP address and port address field out of the machine in Pearson Access Next. You can retain the information in case you'd like to re-add Proctor caching later, or if you need a history of Proctor caching for any reason. But the basics of this is that if the IP and port address fields are blank, the test will not be cached. So all of these methods that we're going to go over is just how to remove those IP and port address fields in PAN so that your responses will not be cached. If you want to remove several Proctor caching machines at once, so maybe you don't want to go into the user interface and delete them one by one, there are a couple options to do so. If you want to avoid removing the IP and port addresses from the current machines, in case you want to immediately go back, or in the middle of testing you need to, for some reason, Proctor cache, you can add a new Proctor caching machine and leave the port and IP addresses blank on that entry, so you can call it no cache or something like that. And then you'll need to make that machine the default machine. And by creating the no cache machine without an IP and port address fields, all of your test sessions will automatically point to it. And so when you create a new test session, it'll go to that no cache machine, and your information will not be cached. As mentioned before, the pro to this method is that you can fall back easily to the old caching machines if necessary. The second option for bulk removing Proctor caching machines is to perform a bulk upload to the Pearson Access Next system to remove the IP and port addresses from multiple entries at once. So in this case, you will pull an export of your current TestNav configurations, remove the port and IP addresses from that file, and then re-import the updated file. Through this method, if you save the original export with the port and IP addresses still attached, you can re-import that file if you ever need to fall back on the other caching machines at any time. If you are using Proctor caching for this year, the information on this slide will just kind of help you with your network configurations. These ports are going to be the same as they have been in previous years. So we're going to go over the next few slides fairly quickly because Proctor caching, like I mentioned, isn't as popular as it has been in previous years. As mentioned before, most schools will not need to Proctor cache in 2022, but if you are Proctor caching and you have questions after we go over all of these slides, definitely feel free to reach out to either Pearson or Aussie, and we can point you in the right direction or help you set up your Proctor caching. If you are Proctor casting, this slide shows a bit more information about what Proctor caching is, what's happening behind the scenes when you Proctor cache, and why you may need to do so for lower internet speeds. This is a visual of how Proctor caching fits into the overall testing process. So if you are Proctor caching, you have a test cache machine which grabs all the student responses and then sends it to Pearson in one go. To the TestNav server, whereas without Proctor caching, those responses are automatically sent to Pearson as the student tests. If you're Proctor caching, there are some requirements for Proctor caching, and this slide kind of goes over some of those as well as how to implement it and download Proctor caching to a device. This download is available at the same link as the TestNav application download, so everything's sort of in one place there. These are some basic setup instructions if you're using Proctor caching, how to download, how to run the installer, adding it to a computer, all of that stuff is held on this slide here. And then here's just a screenshot of how to download Proctor caching. Like I mentioned before, this is available just on the same download page as the TestNav app itself. There's just a link for download Proctor cache here. The next few slides show you how to create and edit TestNav configurations for Proctor caching. If you're removing Proctor Casting machines, you can do so on a one-by-one basis in the same menu as Proctor Caching is added. So you'll follow these same steps of, creating and editing TestNav configurations, and that's where you'll delete the IP and port addresses for not Proctor Caching. This is a screenshot of what adding a new configuration looks like. These fields should look fairly familiar from the screenshots before of how to remove Proctor Caching. But the required fields are marked with red asterisks on here, and you'll note that the IP and port address fields are not required, and so that's why removing those will remove Proctor Caching. And then another screenshot of what adding Proctor Caching looks like, what the fields you need to fill out are, and then those port and IP address fields, they're filled out if you are Proctor Caching here. This is what that screenshot shows, whereas deleting those, like I said, will avoid Proctor Caching. After you make any changes to your Proctor Caching machines and save, you'll see the machine pop up on the left-hand side of the screen and then a green success message at the top. So then you'll know that your changes have been saved and that everything's good to go. This slide shows how to edit machine after it's been added. And so this is what you'll go to if you're not Proctor Caching, want to remove those addresses. This is where you'll go for a one-by-one removal versus those bulk imports or, yeah. And then with multiple TestNav settings, you can now change the default configuration by checking that default computer use for sessions. Like I said, if you're adding a no cache machine for avoiding Proctor Caching, this is the button we were talking about earlier. Versus if you do have a default Proctor Caching machine you want your sessions to point to, that's the button you'll use to do that. Note that pre-caching computer override does not override all Proctor Caching. That's a common misconception in Pearson Access Next. You will need to remove those port and IP addresses. This option controls an override only if the Proctor Caching machine is unavailable at a given time. So that's what the pre-caching computer override means, is that if it is unavailable, then those responses will not be cached. They'll just be sent directly to TestNav. So again, the common misconception here is that this means that that it removes or overrides Proctor Caching altogether, and it does not. So you just want to make sure to point that out. And then note, if you want to use Proctor Caching, TestNav configurations will value school cache machines over district cache machines. So if there are no school cache machines added, they will go to a district Proctor Caching machine. And if there are schools added, that's the first one that TestNav will use. After you add your Proctor Caching machines, you'll also need to set up pre-cache by test in order to actually pre-cache test content. So there's sort of two parts to setting up Proctor Caching, the machines, and then pre-cache by test. The next few slides go over instructions on doing so. Again, we're going to go fairly quickly through these because of the declining popularity of Proctor Caching in general. So this is the edit screen where you can choose which test to pre-cache in Pearson Access Next. And then once you select the test, you'll be taken to this screen, which will show you what tests are available, which ones are, what the status of the caching is. All of that stuff will be on this screen. The test tab on that previous screenshot will show you information about test content and caching status. The clients tab shows client connectivity, so your machines. And then you can monitor the status of pre-caching, again, through this same window. So you can see there are a few different status messages that may appear. So OK, not loading or waiting, and then fail to load content. This slide gives a little bit more information about the client tab and monitoring the status of the clients. So you can see the screenshot here. You have similar status icons with similar colors of OK, idle, all that stuff. And here's just a closer look at what those status tabs look like and what they mean. So for idle, 5 to 30 minutes since the client was active. Long idle is 30 minutes to 12 hours. And then clients are removed from this list after 12 hours of inactivity. If you need to change your password at any time for the Proctor Caching Proctor Caching windows, you can do so in the settings. There's a link here that provides some information on password settings, why you might want to change your password or anything like that. So I know we went quickly through this section, but again, if you're using Proctor Caching, you have any additional questions on setting up or monitoring Proctor Caching, feel free to reach out to us and we can definitely help with that. All right, so that's the end of that section. Are there any questions that anybody has?
There was a question in the chat about if sessions are already created, if one or more pre-caching computer is available, then the session creation screen requires you to select one. So for sessions that have already been created that are connected to a pre-caching configuration, you'll either have to edit. If you choose not to Proctor Cache, you'll either need to edit that configuration to remove the IP and port to not Proctor Cache, or you'll have to change the connection if you choose to change your default to a no cache configuration. So yes, if you're currently connected to a Proctor Caching configuration in a session you've already created and don't want to cache, you're going to have to update that configuration either by removing it or connecting to another one. Now, if you have no configuration set up, so you've deleted all of them, then the session creation screen won't require you to select pre-caching computer.
I think this is something that I get maybe was set up by DC. I'm a non-public test coordinator, and there's only one option. It says only for DCPS, and it did not allow me to create sessions without selecting that. Is that okay? Like, I don't know where that goes. It's not at my school. I don't know anything about it. I talked to Pearson Access Next support, and they said don't worry about it. But I like listening to all this. I'm like, do I need to worry about it? Can I just leave it if that's the only way I could create my sessions?
That is going to be up to each of your individual LEAs, but from a technical perspective, as long as the pre-caching computer that you're configured to has downloaded the content and is working, there should be no issues. And my assumption is maybe that configuration was set up already no cache. So within your organization, if there's one there, it's going to require you to select one. So I don't want to say you won't have any issues, but my first interpretation of what you asked is that you won't.
Okay.
But again, there's another thing would be just to complete that infrastructure trial and secure training to check to make sure everything's okay within your technology configuration.
Okay, and can I get rid of it as somebody who just has access to a certain number of students, like through the setup dropdown? Or is
without knowing your specifics, and we might need to get you with additional support, but my understanding would be because you're under DCPS, that configuration is set up as the default for all of your organizations, so it's requiring you to select it. So I don't think there's anything you have to do to undo that.
Okay, thank you.
This is Kim Lake. I had a problem with that. If it forces you to do that and you don't clear it out, I couldn't get any of my DC students to test without it. Someone at Pearson helped me, like, I don't know if you space it out or clear it that says you don't have Proctor Caching, because we don't have Proctor Caching here. It does give you problems.
Okay, thanks, Kim. I'll contact Pearson then.
Yeah.
We should be able to get you to a level 2 tech support technician to troubleshoot your individual problem.
Yeah, you got to get rid of that Proctor Caching if you don't have it. Otherwise, you think you're good. And I did my infrastructure trial and everything was good, but then the students, it would say I couldn't connect to that Proctor Caching server when I had an actual student in the room trying to test with it, because we don't use it.
It should work by deleting the port.
Yeah, that's what you got to do.
Yeah,
Yes.
If you delete the port and IP address as Kaylee showed in the training, then what it does is it, rather than looking to go to your Proctor Caching server, it comes to Pearson directly for your content. So as long as you have an internet connection, it should come to us just fine. And usually that's a better experience than Proctor Caching anyway. Proctor Caching kind of, if not configured correctly, can actually cause some more problems. So our recommendation is not to cache at all. but we understand that everybody has different bandwidth availability and technical requirements, so we still support it. But the best experience for a student will be getting the content directly from us rather than your caching machine. But again, level 2 has the instructions to support. So if you're having any trouble, you can always contact customer support, and they'll get you connected with a level 2 agent that can help clear up any issues you're having.
Thank you.
Yep.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. And then I did see a question in the chat about sharing the slides so that folks can follow along. I don't know, Stephanie, if you have that up and can share those, or if you want to just wait until after the training.
Yeah, we'll be posting the slides and the recording to the ASI website probably within about a day after the training.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. Okay, any other questions before we move on to the infrastructure trial? Okay, great, thank you. So the infrastructure trial, the purpose of infrastructure trials are to ensure that the student testing experience is seamless. You're checking that TestNav is working correctly and that the network can bear the load of testing. It also can help staff and students become familiar with TestNav before being put into the actual testing environment. So it's just kind of a trial test run to make sure everything's working correctly. Everyone knows their roles and what they're doing, all that stuff. Before the actual infrastructure trial takes place, there are some steps that you need to take to prepare. These instructions can all be found in the infrastructure trial guide, which is posted on that DC resource page that I showed at the beginning, dc.mypearsonsupport.com. The trial itself should take about an hour, and any feedback that you have based on that trial can be provided to your LEA after the infrastructure trial takes place. All district and school personnel involved in online testing should be part of the infrastructure trial. As mentioned before, this is a chance for everyone to become familiar with the testing platform as well as PAN, and it's up to districts and schools to decide at what level the trial should take place, either at the district level or the school level. You can contact your district to ask that question. As mentioned before, the infrastructure trial guide can be found on the DC resources page. It's under the technology setup, user guides, additional technology resources. Note also that to conduct the infrastructure trial, you'll need to access the PAN training site, which we have a screenshot of on the next slide. So I mentioned earlier in this presentation, we have a training site and a production site. So these are the screenshots sort of showing the difference between those two. Note the color of the banners. So the training site has a brown banner across the top, so that's how you'll know you're sort of in the test training area of PAN. And then the production site has that grayish black banner across the top. Note that if you add users to one or the other of these sites, they're not connected in any way. So adding students to the training site does not automatically add them to the production site and vice versa, as well as users. So if you do not have access to the training site, you may still have access to the production site and also vice versa. So just want to make sure to point that out. Technology coordinators should follow these steps prior to the infrastructure trial, including adding or removing any Proctor Caching configurations if they are needed. And then also going through some device readiness steps, and all of this again is held within that infrastructure trial guide posted on the DC resource site. Districts and schools will need to create sample students and sessions prior to the infrastructure trial, as well as print the student testing tickets in order to conduct the infrastructure trial. And then here's some more detailed information on creating those sample students in the training site. These instructions will be the same as creating students in the live production site. So again, this is just a way to kind of test drive, adding students, creating sessions, starting the sessions, all of that stuff. So it'll be the same between training and production. Note that classes are going to be useful for adding large number of students to a session at once. So you can do that through PAN. And then once you create your students, you'll need to go in and add sample sessions before the infrastructure trial takes place. Again, these instructions are the same as the live production site as they are in the training site, so you'll follow the same steps. This is what the Create Sessions screen will look like, so you can see the fields that you may need to add. The session name, organization, test assigned, everything that's required is marked by a red asterisk. And then here's how you'll add students to a session by a class, for instance. So we talked about classes being an easy way to add a group of students. You can find by class in Practice School, so then you can just add a whole class to a session instead of adding students one by one. After the students are added, you'll need to go in and prepare the session for testing. This can be done anytime the training site is available for infrastructure trials, so that it is available. You can perform your infrastructure trial now. And then you'll also need to start the sessions and unlock the units before students can log in. And again, you can do this anytime before testing and after the session is prepared. The session must be prepared before it can be started and units can be unlocked. You can print testing tickets using the resource drop-down menu at the top right of the screen, as shown here within a session. And then you'll perform your infrastructure trial. So once the infrastructure trial is over, you can contact the Pearson Support Center for any technology issues you encounter. And then, as we mentioned before, share any feedback you have with your district and state and confirm that you've completed the trial successfully. So that brings us to the end of the infrastructure trial session. Are there any questions that anybody has? I see we have a question about using sample students for the infrastructure trial or loading the Srpmp. I don't know, Jeff or Stephanie, if you have any opinions one way or the other on that.
I think that's an OSSI policy question to answer. We don't have any requirements on our end that prevent that, but Stephanie, can you weigh in here?
Sure. Yeah, I think that if an LEA wants to load their Srpmp and load actual student information in the training site, that's fine, as long as you are being very cognizant of which site production or training you're loading into, so that the information that is in the production site is the actual information for test administration. But I understand that folks might also want to use actual student names in the training site for infrastructure trial, and that's fine. As long as you're making sure that the authoritative data is in the production site for active administration.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Do we have any other questions about the infrastructure trial before we move on to testing? All right. So before testing, note that for 2022 testing, the following fields have been added for student registration. These fields are all explained in the Srpmp field definitions document, which again is on the Pearson Access Next site under support and then documentation. There's a page there that has the Srpmp field definitions guide. So you can see what all of these fields are for, how to fill them out, all of that through there. Srpmp data is combined into a single file, which is used to register and customize students for assessment. The Srpmp can be used at any time.
So Kayla, we have two more questions in the chat. Okay. The first one is, what would be the min-max amount of students for the test trial, so the infrastructure trial?
Do you want to answer that, Jeff, or do you want me to?
I don't think we have any min-max. Our recommendation is to make sure it's reflective of an event that'll happen on test day to truly test your infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's something we mentioned too earlier in the slides, is that especially if you are trying to figure out if you need to Proctor Cast or not, you want to make sure to test the full network load, so as many students as may be testing at one time. So, yeah.
And then the next question was, can you explain extensions a little more?
Yeah, and I think, Jeff, you're definitely the extensions expert, so I'll let you kind of explain that. Is it the co-write and read-write extensions, correct?
Yeah, so what extensions does, so for those of you who have used co-writer or read and write for text-to-speech, speech-to-text, or word prediction, there's been some limitations within TestNav security and some trouble getting those things working, especially for those folks who've used it as the extension in the Google browser, the Chrome browser. So what the extensions does now is it will enable a version very similar to the co-writer and read-to-write extension within the Chrome browser directly in the TestNav app. So students within the TestNav app will be able to access a user menu for those different supports directly in the TestNav app. So they can enable word prediction, text-to-speech, or speech-to-text. It won't save the preference settings. So if students have licensed software from Text Help or for read and write or co-writer, it won't keep their settings or the licensing, but it will allow them to use the same functionality embedded directly within TestNav. So it puts the player right in the shell of TestNav, so students can use it. So if you plan to try that out, again, I would suggest creating a practice test with the extensions field enabled and logging into that test to kind of see how it works. But it's not enabling anything else other than co-writer or read and write directly in the platform. What happens when the student logs in is they'll be asked to select which extension they're using, whether it's co-writer or read and write. And then when they launch the test will be enabled with that in the toolbar. And I hope that was clear. So Kaylee, correct me if you think I missed anything, but it's a bit complicated, but it's a better solution now that since we can't support browser testing.
So, sorry, to confirm, we've never done speech to text because we thought it always required an external device to administer. Are you saying that this extensions would allow a student to utilize speech to text without needing a human scribe?
This would enable the speech to text functionality specifically within either co-writer or read and write directly in the Nav app. So yes, the speech to text functionality would work. In the past, we haven't required. There are co-writer and read and write could work with TestNav, but there were some security problems. So people, it was a complicated configuration. There was a lot of work to do to get it to work. So most folks just went to the external third-party device and transcribed as a I don't want to say easier solution, but a more user-friendly solution. So yeah, if those students are using read and write or co-writer for speech to text, they now can enable it directly in the TestNav platform. I would caution that if those students are not familiar with the technology, are not using co-writer or read and write for the speech to text functionality in their daily instruction, I wouldn't consider this the solution unless you built some familiarity with the functionalities of those assistive technologies within the assessment platform. I'd want to make sure that they had the opportunity to practice with it and became familiar before test day.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Awesome, thank you, Jeff.
No problem.
All right, so going back to Srpmp data, you can add this data either through an upload or manually through the user interface. The instructions on this slide go through how to do both. Note that both methods require an understanding of the Srpmp field definitions document and the file layout documents. And again, I'm going to show you a screenshot of where these are at. These are in PAN under the support menu icon and then documentation. So this is the Srpmp field definitions document, and then the file layout is in here as well.
Kaylee, we have another question. The question is, does the test have built-in speech-to-text software? And the answer to that is no, we do not build speech-to-text directly into our platform. The reason for that is students use different technology, and we try to make it so external assistive technology can work within our platform and be accessible. We don't want students having to learn another. So no, there's no embedded speech-to-text outside of what we just discussed and what we are supporting with Co-Writer and Read and Write directly in the platform.
Awesome, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, we also wanted to note that Srpmp Imports are due February 22nd for initial material shipments. For any imports or any added students after this date, users will need to submit an additional order for materials. The additional order window opens on March 21st. Additional orders, if you do submit them, should arrive in districts and schools 4 business days after the shipment has been approved. However, due to COVID, there may be global shipping delays that could cause shipments to arrive later than scheduled. But again, if you do need to have any additional orders, that window opens on March 21st. All right, if you're manually adding students into Pearson Access Next, you'll need to do so through the user interface as shown in the next few slides here. You can also select the Create and Registration tasks on the Setup Students page and then click Start. And that's how you'll create the students and register them for testing. This page just shows where you're going to add the student details. Note that the preferred first name is new for spring 2022, but it is not a required field. Once the student has been created, you'll need to register for them for a test session as shown on this screen. So you'll need to be selecting their grade level, school code, all of that stuff on the screen. After you assign them, you'll need to assign them to a test and an organization. So this is just that form filled out for a student. And then once the student's added, you'll need to create a session for the student to reside in. So this is the new session screen where you'll fill out a session name, choose an organization, test assigned, start date, times, form groups, all of that is held on this screen. As in the infrastructure trial guide, you can add students to the session by either name individually or by class at the school or district level. So there are sort of 4 options: name at the school level, name at the district level, so on. Be sure to select all of the students in order to save them into the session. You'll need to select them individually unless you are doing it by class. After students have been added to a session, you can print the testing tickets in the same way as you did in the infrastructure trial, again on this screen for a session. And then, again, as we did in the infrastructure trial, you'll need to prepare the session, but you will need to do this 1 school day prior to testing when you're doing the operational test. And this will allow you to start multiple test sessions at one time. So in order to prepare a session, you need to have an LEA or school test coordinator user role in PAN. Preparing the session will assign the forms to the student in each test session. Before you complete this step, make sure that all the appropriate accommodations are assigned to your students. If accommodations are not accurately assigned before you prepare the session, the student will need to be removed from the session, edited, and then re-added back into the session. Once the session is prepared and the testing window is open, your testing can begin. These screenshots show in the session list how to view what sessions have been prepared, what sessions are in progress, which are not prepared. Note the different colored dots on the side of the session list for just a quick view of where things are at. For students who do have accommodations assigned, there will be indicators that appear next to the student ID on the student's in-session screen. These indicators show different forms which cannot be combined, so you can't have a student with an ASL and an SR form, for instance. The indicators can be used to identify errors in the accommodation settings as well. Before students can test, you must start the session via the green icon in Pearson Access Next and unlock the students for tests, or unlock the units for the students. This can be done at any time before testing and after the testing window is open and the session is prepared. We just wanted to quickly point out here the reports menu in PAN. You can pull reports to get an idea of student counts, students who are registered for tests but who haven't been assigned to tests, P&P accommodations for students, and more. And that's all through the reports menu and then operational reports in Pearson Access Next. If you need to move a student to your organization or school, you can submit a ticket in the OSSI support tool, which is linked here. Note that this tool is used to move students between LEAs. If a student is changing schools within the same LEA, the LEA can complete the transfer themselves. They don't need to submit the ticket. All right, and then that brings us to the end of the preparations for testing. So I see we have a few questions in the chat.
Actually, Kaylee, I think those were all my responses
Okay.
in chat as well to those questions, just to make sure they were covered both in the presentation and in the chat.
Perfect. Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.
I currently I don't see any additional questions right now.
Okay, great. Does anybody have any questions about preparing sessions, preparing for testing? All right, we will jump into the testing process now during testing. So during testing, administrators will need to lock and unlock each unit of the test for students. Only one unit can be unlocked at a time per student. The unit will need to be locked before unlocking, so the previous unit will need to be locked before unlocking the next unit for testing. And note also that students need to be in a ready or resume status in PAN in order to log into TestNav. So we'll show you screenshots of what all of this looks like. So this screen just shows how to lock and unlock student units. Note you just use this slider icon to lock and unlock a unit for testing. Note that the indicators for students are in ready or resume status are down here near the bottom of the screen. You can change the status of a student by using the drop-down menus, and we'll show that in more detail a little bit later on here. You can also see on this screen students who may have been exited from a test, either on purpose or on accident, and then you can change the student status back to resumed, again, via that drop-down menu. So you can click into an individual student in your session to track their progress through the test. The bar at the top of the screen shows sort of a high-level view of the current status of where they're at, how many questions they've answered, how many they've seen, and how many they have not seen or that remain in the test. And then you can also see a detailed list question by question of which questions they've answered, seen, and not seen. And this can really help alert you if a student accidentally skips a question, such as in this example, question 3, they haven't visited or answered it, and that just means that they accidentally may have, skipped over it when they were testing. So going back to the session screen, the student test statuses are color-coded for what the student status is. So a gray color means they're ready, yellow means they're resumed, green is active. All of those are color-coded. And if you need to resume several students at once, you can either use the drop-down menu on your session screen. So as we were talking about before, if students have been exited, you just click that drop-down icon and go to resume. Or you can check several students using the radio buttons here and then go to the resume student test task in the drop-down menu at the top of that screen.
And Kaylee, there is a question in the chat. It says, if they do skip a question like that, what is the action we can take? So I think that really is a policy decision for Stephanie to weigh in on.
Yeah, I agree. And also, just so you know, at the end of the test nav session, it should alert the student that they skipped a question. But yeah, I'll let Stephanie answer from a policy perspective how to handle that situation.
Thanks. And yeah, this is something that is covered in OSSI's test security training as well. There are a lot of laws and regulations governing the administration of statewide assessments in DC, as I'm sure you may know. One of them being the Testing Integrity Act, which has very clear guidance to administrators about refraining from educator coaching. And that includes things like reminding students that they've missed a question or telling them even to check their work is something that may be considered a test security violation and could result in invalidating scores of a test. So if you do see that a student has missed questions, there is really not a lot of guidance you can give them other than asking them, are you finished and do you want to log out of your test? But there's very little room for letting students know that they should go check their work. So in conclusion, I think seeing that they've missed a question is something that just is information you have, but there's not much that you can do to rectify that other than asking the student, are you finished and ready to close out your test?
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Okay, so as mentioned earlier, if a student is assigned an incorrect accommodation after the session has been prepared, you need to remove the student from the session before updating their P&P. And then once you've updated that student, you can re-add them to the session. So this is a common error we encounter is a student has been in a session that's been prepared and they have the wrong accommodations. This is the steps that you take how to fix that. For makeup testing, you can either create a new session specifically for students who need to make up an exam, or you can also leave those students in the original session and manage the test through the combined view in the test session status page. You can allow students to test out of order for makeup testing only, so Unit 2 before Unit 1. And then directions and other information about makeup testing can be accessed via the DC resource site under Administration Resources, Pearson Access Next Resources. That's where that's at. This slide details the steps to follow for both keeping students in the original testing session as well as moving them to a separate makeup session. Note that putting students into a new session specifically for makeup testing will require the user to print and use new student testing tickets. They cannot use the same testing tickets from the previous session. Once testing is complete, if a student was unable to finish their unit or test for whatever reason, you'll need to go in and manually mark that student's test as complete. Every student must show a completed status in PAN when testing has ended in order to be scored. You can mark student test complete by selecting the task from the top drop-down menu in the first screenshot here, and then marking each unit that needs to be complete, or you can do so from the tasks menu. So this is what the second screenshot just shows, a more detailed view of what that task looks like. You select the radio button next to whoever has been, hasn't completed their session, and then you just click the Mark Complete button. Throughout testing, you can check student statuses via the dashboards that we mentioned earlier. It's new for 2022, or the operational reports. The 3 reports shown here on this slide are particularly helpful during administration. Note that the student or the session roster report will show unit statuses. So that's what that report is for. So for technical troubleshooting during testing, one of the most common errors you might see when testing is that the username or password is incorrect. If the username and password on the ticket is being entered correctly and you confirmed that, the student may be on the wrong login page. So the page should show the District of Columbia as shown in the screenshot here. If you need to move to the correct login page, you can select the user icon in the top right-hand corner of the TestNav app and select Choose a Different Customer, and then select the correct page. So when we were talking about the question earlier about changing between Maryland and District of Columbia, it's the user icon in the top right-hand corner, and then Choose a Different Customer. If you encounter any other errors during testing, follow these steps. So have the student log out of the test, resume student in PAN, and then have them log back in again on the same device. This is sort of the equivalent of turning it off and back on again. And then if you encounter the error again, or if the error affects multiple students, you can reach out to your technology coordinator or the Pearson support team. An important note, do not move the student to another device unless the student has safely exited the test via the logout feature. And then on this page, we just have some links that may help in any further troubleshooting, including general TestNav online support, and then the common TestNav error codes that you may encounter. And sometimes, yeah.
We have another question in the chat. The question was, will scholars need to use the same device during testing multiple days?
I'm not familiar with scholars. Can you explain what you mean?
A student.
Oh, a student, okay. So you don't need to necessarily use the same device multiple days. You just need to, like I said before, make sure that that student has logged out of testing successfully before, and that's just common practice before they leave for the day. And then when they come back, they can use a different device, again, as long as they've logged out successfully the day before.
Yeah, the only caveat I would add to that is it's good to know what device a student tested on, because there are save response files stored locally on the computer. So should any technology interruption happen and you need to pull those log files, you need to know where those log files are stored and located, whether it's on the device or in a secondary save location.
Yeah, that's a good thing to note, Jeff. Thanks.
Yep.
All right, so sometimes you may see some strange things in TestNav. It may not show an error, but it may be just acting a little bit weird. So an expected behaviors document for TestNav can be found on that DC resource support site under Administration Resources, Testing Resources. This document can help you determine whether the behaviors you're seeing are normal or whether they are critical issues. So there are some examples here of behaviors that the student expected behavior document covers, such as notepad not being able to be resized, exhibits, window not being able to resize, and all that stuff. All right, so that brings us through testing. Do we have any additional questions about testing? Right, so we have a question about the log files. Is a secondary save location for the log files available for Chromebooks? Jeff, I think you might be the best person to answer that question.
I think we need to take that one away and answer it offline. I would have to dig to refresh my memory on the secondary save locations for Chromebooks.
Okay.
So let's take note of that question and get an answer back.
All right, sounds good. Any other questions about testing? We have another extensions question. For assistive technology like read-write, do the kids log into their accounts for those services through TestNav?
The answer is currently no. They can't log in and have their preferences set. So if their reader write or co-write has done any learning of their word prediction tendencies, those settings won't be saved. It's starting like fresh. We are working on a solution down the road where students could log in to their account through read and write and co-writer, but right now, no, they don't log in.
Awesome, thank you. Any other questions about during testing? All right, so we will go into the after testing section. So once testing is complete, you must stop the session in TestNav before the student test can be scored. And as we mentioned before, all of the students in a session must be either marked complete or in a completed status before you can stop the session. Otherwise, you won't be able to stop the session or score student responses. So any students still in a ready status should be removed from a session, and students in an exited or resumed status can be moved to other sessions to complete testing. So you can remove students from a session by selecting the correct tasks on the top drop-down menu, and then you can select the radio buttons next to the indicated students and then click remove, the remove icon at the bottom of the screen. And then you can mark complete all unsubmitted tests by selecting the correct task, again from the top drop-down menu, selecting the radio buttons, and then selecting mark complete. So a quick note here that all of the SSIDs listed here are for fake students, so we're not sharing any information for real students. But if you see the flag in the top right-hand corner of the screen is red, there may be students with warnings and errors that need to be resolved before the administration ends. So you can click on the warning and errors to go to the student page and select the students with issues, and then use the register students task to see what the errors are and how to resolve them. Note that the English learner active status and student with disabilities are two of the most common critical warnings. So you can see go to the Srpmp field definitions document on the support documentation page to confirm all critical warnings. When you get to the register students task, if you're resolving those warnings, you'll see the student warnings and errors on this page sort of highlighted as you see in a yellowish orange color here. These screenshots show an example of a student where the errors reside in their ethnicity and student status fields. So you'll need to fill in those fields and click save in order to resolve the warnings in this case. If you are Proctor Caching, once testing is complete, you should go in and purge the test content from the Proctor Caching computers. So that's just clicking this purge button from the Proctor Cache page here. And for any post-administration activities, these are some examples of some of the common operational reports that might be helpful to you, including students who have not completed testing who you need to mark their test complete. All right, so that brings us to the end of the post-administration activities. Are there any questions about anything we just went over? All right. We will move on to sort of our last section here, just some additional information and resources. So practice tests and tutorials are available for students on the DC resource site under test preparation. So that's, we put some links here for both practice tests and tutorials for students to access. And then non-secure practice tests and tutorials can also be accessed in TestNav, as we talked about earlier. So you can access them via the link on the login page here. As we noted earlier in the training, the support documentation section of PAN holds several important resources, including the Srpmp field definitions document that we mentioned several times throughout the training. So again, in order to access that on Pearson Access Next, you just go to the support icon up here and then documentation. If you encounter any issues with Pearson Access Next, testing, shipments, additional orders, or really anything else, the Pearson Call Center is happy to help. The call center is open 6 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Eastern Time, Monday through Friday. If you do use the call center, we encourage you to complete the surveys at the end of the calls. We are always looking for ways to continuously improve our processes and our support, and the surveys really help us to do that. So we encourage you all to take those surveys. And then one final resource we wanted to make sure to point out is the PARCC Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual. This manual is posted online on the DC resource site under Manuals. right, so we'll pause here once again for Q&A. If there are any additional questions that we didn't answer during the training, or if anything else came up that you want to ask, we wanted to give you all some time to ask those questions. So we have a question about the recording. Can we get the recording emailed to us? I'm going to turn that one over to Stephanie.
Thanks. Yeah, the recording will be posted on OSSI's website on the test coordinator resources page. We usually get those up within about 48 business hours of the training. And Chelsea has just posted the link where it will be posted.
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie. Any additional questions that anybody has? All right, well, as always, we are here to help. So we appreciate you attending this training and for all of your great questions throughout. So I will turn time over to Stephanie to close us out. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kaylee and Jeff, for the presentation and for answering questions that came up. And thank you all for attending this morning. If you do have additional questions that come to you later, please do feel free to reach out to OSSI's assessment team. You can email us at ossi.assessment@dc.gov. And Chelsea has just put that email in the chat. Thank you so much. And we are happy to answer any questions you may have. I know that it's a very busy time in schools now and really appreciate your time and attention to making sure that you are prepared for a successful 2022 administration. I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day and a great weekend, and we will be in touch later on. Thanks, everyone.